as a co-equal branch of government entrusted by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, with responsibility to raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, and under Article 1, Section 9, to pay for those actions of the government Congress deems prudent. And these projects that are currently pending with the administration are the U.S. nuclear force reductions under the New START Treaty and the associated 1251 plan, which provides for the modernization of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, including the triad of nuclear delivery systems, nuclear warheads, and the infrastructure that supports them. The so-called Nuclear Posture Review Implementation Study, or mini-NPR, which we understand is intended to provide the President with options, possibly for future reductions in U.S. nuclear forces, and NATO's Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, or DDPR, which will likely make recommendations regarding U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. As the witnesses know, the House of Representatives in FY12 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, exercised its constitutional responsibilities for supporting the armed forces and stewardship of the taxpayers' resources to pass a variety of provisions related to these administration projects. In reviewing Dr. Miller's testimony, I see that he is prepared to discuss these NDAA provisions in detail, and we certainly look forward to that. Regarding the modernization program that is at the heart of the agreement that led to ratification of the New START Treaty, let me quote from Secretary Gates in his testimony before the Armed Services Committee last June. He said, quote, "Frankly and just basically realistically, I see this treaty as a vehicle to finally be able to get what we need in the way of modernization that we have been unable to get otherwise." These are powerful words, and they effectively show what I think all the witnesses understand, that the New START and nuclear modernization are a package deal. Indeed, the New START resolution of ratification that was passed by the Senate makes it clear that in the absence of full funding for the modernization program, the President needs to explain to the Congress whether it is still in the interests of the United States to remain a party to the agreement. I quote from Condition 9 of the resolution. It says, quote, "If appropriations are enacted that fail to meet the resource requirements set forth in the President's 10-year 1251 plan, the President shall submit to Congress a report detailing whether and why, in the changed circumstance brought about by the resource shortfall, it remains in the national interest of the United States to remain a party to the START Treaty." I am pleased the President followed through on his commitment to request the funds for modernization of the nuclear deterrent pursuant to his revised 1251 plan. I am, however, concerned that the administration did not request an anomaly for the nuclear modernization program for this first continuing resolution that expires on the 18th of this month. In other words, the administration asked for the dollars in the budget, but when it comes to the issue of actually funding that, the administration did not ask for, in the continuing resolution, an anomaly that would have preserved that funding for the short-term CR. As we are now headed towards a second CR, possibly until the end of this year, it will be telling to me as to whether or not the administration requests an anomaly for NNSA weapons activities this time around. Likewise, I am deeply troubled that your written testimony for today, Mr. D'Agostino, appears to us to have been watered down by the White House Office of Management and Budget from its initially strong statement of complete support for the President's full budget request for weapons activities to what can be considered a tepid statement of support for some level of modernization funding. One would think it would be relatively easy for the administration officials to state support for the President's full budget request. General Kaler, I understand that you've been working with DoD and OMB to finalize a letter regarding proposed cuts to weapon activities. I wanted to express my interest in hearing from you directly and Admiral Winfield, the senior military leadership for nuclear weapons, on this issue. I am not certain why the OMB cannot support the President's budget request for FY12, but I intend to ask each of the witnesses whether or not they would recommend to the President an anomaly for NNSA in the event of another CR, and whether the continued funding of the nuclear modernization program in FY13, pursuant to the current Section 1251 plan, should be supported. The answer to the second question should be an easy yes, because as the witnesses know in a letter to several senators in December of last year, while working to secure ratification of the New START Treaty, the President pledged to support the nuclear modernization program for as long as he is in office. I am, however, pleased that the Department of Defense is working hard to assist in securing this funding. Of course, a lot of this funding is the Department of Defense's own money, as the Memorandum of Agreement between the Department of Defense and Department of Energy concerning modernization of the U.S. nuclear force infrastructures makes clear. In May 2010, DoD committed to invest $5.7 billion of its own budgetary authority in NNSA's modernization program, with an additional $2.6 billion promised since then. These funds must go to that purpose and not to other parochial purposes like local water infrastructure projects, which we see as a threat to some of this continued funding. Now, this document, the Memorandum of Agreement between the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy concerning modernization of the U.S. nuclear infrastructure, kind of a long title, is marked for official use only, and therefore I hesitate to put it as part of the unclassified record of this hearing. I'm going to ask Dr. Miller and Mr. D'Agostino if your staff will work with our committee staff to determine what portion of this document is sensitive and what needs to be redacted so that we can put in an unclassified version as part of the record. Regarding the NPR implementation study, I'm anxious to learn the process being followed for the study and the policy considerations and force structure options that are under review. While I'm aware that many previous administrations have put their imprint on these matters, I am not aware of any previous administration that has stated the answer to its review before conducting or completing it. In this case, the predetermined answer appears to be that further reductions are being considered and may be made. Let's look at the record of statements from administration officials about this study. From the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, quote, "The President has directed a review of potential future reductions in U.S. nuclear weapons below New START levels," close quote. President Obama's National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, at the Carnegie Endowment in March of this year stated, quote, "We're making preparations for the next round of nuclear reductions," close quote. Gary Samore, the White House Coordinator for Arms Control and WMD Terrorism, in an interview in May, stated, quote, "We'll need to do a strategic review of what our force requirements are, and then based on that, the President will have options available for additional reductions. There may be parallel steps that both sides could take, or even unilateral steps the U.S. could take," close quote. Now, let me say again, his quote includes unilateral steps the U.S. could take. Now, I'm curious as to how this could square with a senior White House official with that of Secretary Panetta, who said the following on our March 13th committee hearing. Secretary Panetta just said before us, quote, "With regards to reducing our nuclear arena, I think that is an area where I don't think we ought to do that unilaterally. We ought to do that on the basis of negotiations with the Russians and others to make sure we are all walking the same path." I agree with Secretary Panetta, partially because I have yet to see any dividend from the unilateral steps that we took in abandoning via the NPR the submarine-launched nuclear cruise missile capability or the multiple warhead ICBM capability. Of course, all of this is taking place when the ink on the New START treaty is barely dry, and when data exchanges with the Russian Federation reveal that Russia has actually increased its deployed nuclear forces since the treaty entered into force. Increased. What's more, the witness testimony before this subcommittee on October 14th from Dr. Mark Schneider, a member of the New START treaty negotiation team, and Mr. Richard Fisher, respectively, made clear that, and I quote, "Russia is modernizing every leg of its nuclear triad with new, more advanced systems," and quote, "China is steadily increasing its numbers and capabilities of the ballistic missiles it deploys and is actively working to develop a submarine-based nuclear deterrent force, something it has never had." Yet, the administration reviews are all being done to support further U.S. reductions. This is concerning. Lastly, there is a NATO deterrence and defense posture review that is being discussed with our allies in Europe. Recently, as the chairman of the United States delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I was able to discuss this issue with our allies in a meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly in Bucharest. It was clear that many of our allies were deeply concerned with the direction that this review may take. For example, some NATO members have suggested that mere geographical relocation would be a serious step that the Russians could take to address the thousands of tactical nuclear weapons they have deployed on our allies' borders. Of course, mere relocation of Russian nuclear weapons to some point farther east is not a serious step, and is certainly no reduction in their disproportionately large stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons. That is why the Defense and Security Committee of the Parliamentary Assembly adopted unanimously my proposal to make clear that the geographic relocation will not be considered a reduction in Russian arms. I note that even the Russian delegation did not object to the designation that geographical relocation does not constitute a reduction in Russian arms. I look forward to learning more about the DDPR from our witnesses. And finally, I'm also concerned that the administration may be seeking to amend the NATO-Russia Council Charter to create guarantees regarding missile defense. That has no support here and should be a non-starter. This is a very important hearing, and I want to reiterate my thanks to each of our witnesses for appearing. I'll now turn to our ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Sanchez, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize to you for my voice. I'm a little under the weather today. I would like to join Chairman Turner in welcoming Dr. Miller, General Kaler, Ellen, Undersecretary Tauscher, and Administrator D'Agostino for being before us once again. I look forward to hearing about the opportunities and the progress in moving beyond a Cold War arsenal. I'd like to know, hopefully through this hearing, what our requirements are and how we'll implement the policies and vision outlined in the Nuclear Posture Review, including how we can maintain a strong and reliable deterrent at lower levels, and what kind of arsenal we need to address current and foreseeable threats, and of course, how do we do that in a fiscally responsible manner? And at the end of my comments, I'll make a comment about the controversial NDAA provisions contained in that bill. But first, I'm pleased that the President is leading the much-needed efforts to reduce the dangers posed by nuclear weapons in this post-war era, because, of course, we've got to move beyond policies and force structure derived from Cold War era requirements and shift to deterrents that protect us today, looking at particularly the threats that are out there, and there are many. President Obama noted in his Palm Sunday speech in Prague in 2009 that the existence of thousands of nuclear weapons is probably the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. Even with the considerable reductions of the past decades, it's still important to remember that the United States and Russia still maintain thousands of nuclear weapons. Over 95% of the nuclear weapons available are in those two countries' hands. And so there's a lot of progress that can be made in bringing down those levels and in assuring and checking and working with each other to ensure that it is a safer world. In 2009, the National Defense Authorization Act mandated independent commission on the strategic posture of the United States. It was led by Secretaries Perry and Schlesinger. And they concluded that this is a moment of opportunity to revise and renew the U.S. nuclear strategy, but also a moment of urgency. I think we all agree, and we've talked off to the side, many of us, including with the chairman. There's a lot of movement going on right now in these times, and it is a time of opportunity. The two secretaries noted that the nuclear deterrent of the United States need not play anything like the central role that it did for decades in the U.S. military policy and national security strategy, but it remains an important part to address important problems. And in their 2007 Wall Street Journal op-ed, A World Free of Nuclear Weapons, Secretaries Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry, and Senator Sam Nunn recommended a series of agreed and urgent steps that would lay the groundwork for a world free of the nuclear threat. And among those it included, and I quote, changing the Cold War posture of deployed nuclear weapons to reduce the danger of an accidental or unauthorized use of a nuclear weapon, and continuing to reduce substantially the size of nuclear forces in all states that possess them, and eliminating short-range nuclear weapons designed to be forward deployed, and initiating a bipartisan process to achieve ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We must also take a hard look at what we need to meet our national and our allies' deterrence requirements in light of the current and new threats out there. And we also have the responsibility to bear in mind the ramifications of the current economic crisis. And we must carefully consider what is urgent, what can be delayed, and what is no longer necessary. Given what the requirements are, we must find ways to make smarter investments. And nuclear weapon activities and operations are no exception. We are going through that right now with the Subcommittee, and we have to also take a look at this arena. These are important oversight decisions and, quite honestly, pretty awesome responsibilities for all of us up here and there to take a look at. So I look forward to discussing what the requirements are for our nuclear deterrent, including how do we size our nuclear arsenal to best reflect and address the current threats, what further nuclear weapons reductions may be needed as a tool to strengthen U.S. and international security and stability. Do we need and can we afford to sustain a triad for the next 70 years? What are the decision points? And what considerations impact that decision now? And what are the risks and the cost of retaining forward-based nuclear weapons in Europe merely as a political symbol if they are no longer a unifying element of NATO and a useful military asset? And are there other ways to maintain a strong nuclear NATO alliance? Third, our committee has had an engaging and serious debate on the nuclear policy provisions proposed by the chairman and my Republican colleagues during markup of the House-passed NDAA. There was significant disagreement on these, and for the need for legislative action. There are issues that we have to revise, revisit, address with the Senate as we finalize our bill. And I remain concerned about several of these provisions, including their impact on national security and, quite frankly, whether they're even constitutional. So public debate on these issues is important. I look forward to advancing that debate today. And again, I thank all four of you for being before our committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Now turning to our witnesses. Before they begin, of course, I'd like, if you would, to summarize your testimony with a 5-minute period so we can get to the issue of questions from the members, but also in reminding my opening statement, I would appreciate if you and your comments might incorporate whether you would recommend that in this upcoming continuing resolution that NNSA weapons activities receive full funding and receive, as you know, an anomaly. And also, if you believe that the President should, in 2013, continue his commitment of full funding for modernization. Dr. Miller?
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Sanchez, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am very pleased to join STRATCOM Commander Bob Kaler, Undersecretary Ellen Tauscher, and Administrator D'Agostino. The subcommittee asked us to address the ongoing administration review of U.S. nuclear planning guidance and several additional issues. I'd like to summarize key points from my written statement and ask that the full statement be entered into the record. First, let me start with some numbers for context. The U.S. nuclear arsenal today consists of about 5,000 warheads. In addition, we have several thousand warheads awaiting dismantlement. Unclassified estimates suggest that Russia has 4,000 to 6,500 total nuclear warheads, of which 2,000 to 4,000 are tactical nuclear warheads. China is increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal, but is estimated to have only a few hundred nuclear weapons. North Korea has tested a plutonium-based weapon design and appears to be trying to develop highly enriched uranium design. And Iran continues to defy the will of the international community and pursue its nuclear ambitions. It is in this context that President Obama directed a follow-on analysis to implement the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, or NPR. That work, as the Chairman and Ranking Member noted, is now underway. and we are focused on achieving the 5 objectives described in the Nuclear Posture Review. First, preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. Second, reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy. Third, maintaining strategic deterrence and stability at reduced nuclear force levels. Fourth, strengthening regional deterrence and reassuring U.S. allies and partners. And fifth, and critically importantly, sustaining a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. We expect this analysis to be completed before the end of the calendar year. This NPR implementation study will be followed by new presidential guidance, and then in succession, the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs will then issue more detailed planning guidance to the military, and then STRATCOM will revise its military plans. When complete, our analysis of deterrence requirements will also help inform future arms control proposals, as Undersecretary will discuss in more detail, and I might note, as the military did and the Department of Defense did as part of the Nuclear Posture Review to inform New START treaty negotiations. As the Chairman noted, in parallel to this administration work, NATO is undertaking a deterrence and defense posture review to determine the appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense forces that NATO will need to deter and defend against threats to the alliance. Work is ongoing. We expect it to be complete before spring 2012, prior to the NATO summit in Chicago. And it is proceeding in accordance with the principles that have been central to NATO's nuclear posture for decades, including retaining an appropriate mix of conventional and nuclear capabilities, sharing the risks and burdens of nuclear deterrence, and encouraging Russia to better secure and reduce its arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons. The United States is fully engaged in this effort, and I want to reiterate that any changes in NATO's nuclear posture would only be undertaken as part of a decision by the alliance. A critical issue that we face is ensuring funding for the nuclear enterprise. When he took office, President Obama made reversing the declining budgets for the nuclear complex the top priority. And the administration's Section 1251 report, in fact, includes a plan for over $125 billion in spending on strategic delivery systems and about $88 billion for stockpile and infrastructure costs over a 10-year period. And I would like to thank this subcommittee and committee for supporting the administration's budget request for fiscal year 12. Cuts to NNSA funding in House and Senate appropriations bills are a big concern. The President has asked for the resources that we need, even in a tough fiscal environment. Now we need Congress's help. We look forward to working with this committee and other members to that end. I also want to touch very briefly on a number of provisions of concern in the current version of the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, is passed by the House, H.R. 1540. And I'd be pleased to discuss them further after the statement. H.R. 1540 would dictate the pace of reductions under New START in a way that would bar DoD and DOE from following the most cost-effective means to implement reductions. It could preclude DoD from being logistically able to meet New START treaty timelines for reductions. It would divert resources from stockpile sustainment in ways that tax the very programs that we all want to support. And it would encroach on authorities to set nuclear employment policy that have been exercised by every president in the nuclear age. In conclusion, sustaining the U.S. nuclear deterrent will be the work of many administrations and many Congresses, and we believe strongly that it will require sustained bipartisan support. And even as we face sustained downward pressure on DoD and DOE budgets, we believe we need to sustain a strong bipartisan consensus to address these nuclear issues as apolitical national security priorities. As our work on the NPR implementation study continues, we welcome vigorous and informed debate on these matters of national importance. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to follow-on conversations, including in a classified environment, and look forward to working with the committee on these issues. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sanchez, members of the subcommittee. I really appreciate you inviting me to share my views on strategic nuclear deterrence issues, including the implementation of the Nuclear Posture Review, New START, and nuclear deterrent force requirements. I, too, appreciate the opportunity to join with my colleagues here today as well, and would ask that my full statement be accepted into the record as well. Like Dr. Miller, I think it's useful to place my remarks in the context of the April 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, which placed the prevention of nuclear terrorism and proliferation at the top of the U.S. policy agenda and described how the United States will reduce the role and numbers of nuclear weapons. At the same time, the NPR recognized as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States must maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal to maintain strategic stability with other nuclear powers, deter potential adversaries, and reassure our allies and partners of our security commitments to them. The United States Strategic Command has assigned several important roles in executing the nation's nuclear strategy as it was described in the NPR. First, we are responsible for synchronizing planning for DoD combating weapons of mass destruction efforts in coordination with the other combatant commands, the services, and appropriate U.S. government agencies. Second, our men and women operate the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent forces 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, as directed by the President. And third, we are responsible for providing the President with credible response options to deter attack and to achieve national security objectives should deterrence fail. We do so mindful that deterrence is no longer a one-size-fits-all proposition, that the nation's deterrence approaches must be tailored to today's global environment, and that the nation's deterrence toolkit includes capabilities beyond nuclear weapons. In short, new demands drive our strategy and, in turn, our nuclear requirements and employment planning. As directed in the Nuclear Posture Review, we are now working with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, and the services to inform the review of the nuclear weapons employment guidance that STRATCOM receives from the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. STRATCOM plays a significant role in analyzing how the employment planning guidance drives nuclear force requirements and force structures, and we are playing such a role in the Strategic Requirements Study. We are supporting this study by providing military advice regarding potential changes in employment guidance consistent with the NPR, and we're providing analysis and advice on the force structure and force posture required to meet our strategic needs. As you know, STRATCOM played a similar role providing analysis and advice to the team that developed the U.S. New START negotiating position. We have a little more than 6 years to comply with treaty limits, so we are also working closely with OSD, the Joint Staff, and the services to determine how to implement the treaty provisions safely, securely, and efficiently, what resources, if any, are required to implement the eventual force structure decisions, and how best to phase and synchronize the implementation strategy. The NPR validated the continuing need for the triad, and the 1251 report outlined the necessary sustainment and modernization plans, including requirements and timelines. These plans are essential to maintaining long-term confidence in our nuclear deterrent capabilities. Unfortunately, the nuclear enterprise simultaneously faces significant recapitalization challenges and extraordinary fiscal pressures. But in my view, as the combatant commander responsible for the nuclear deterrent force, for our nation's security, we must invest in these forces and the highly specialized enterprise that supports them. This includes completing our nuclear weapon life extensions, sustaining and beginning the phased modernization of our delivery platforms, conducting scientific surveillance of the stockpile, and eliminating unneeded weapons and positioning for further reductions that may be directed. Mr. Chairman, STRATCOM is moving forward to implement the New START and NPR effectively while maintaining our focus on ensuring a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent force today and for the long term. Thank you again for this opportunity, and thanks to you and the committee for your interest and support. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Undersecretary Tauscher.
Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Sanchez, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify on the future direction of U.S. nuclear weapons policy and posture. I'm always happy to appear before this subcommittee, which provided me the honor of working side by side with many of you over 7 terms in the House. I'm equally proud to be sitting next to my esteemed interagency colleagues and testifying on the Obama administration's nuclear policies. I will focus my initial remarks on 2 areas where State is playing a major role: the ongoing Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, or DDPR, in NATO, and the preparations, process, and expectations for future arms control efforts with Russia and other countries. As outlined 2 years ago by President Obama in Prague, the administration is committed to continuing a step-by-step process to increase U.S. security by reducing nuclear weapons worldwide. That effort includes the pursuit of a future agreement with Russia for reductions in all categories of nuclear weapons: strategic, non-strategic, deployed, and non-deployed. President Obama is committed to seeking to initiate negotiations to address the disparity between the non-strategic nuclear stockpiles of Russia and the United States, and to secure and reduce non-strategic nuclear weapons in a verifiable manner. The key principles that Secretary Clinton outlined at the 2010 NATO Foreign Ministerial meeting in Tallinn will guide our approach. We aim to show strong Allied support for the President's Prague vision and underscore our common view, as the Alliance agreed at the November 2010 Lisbon Summit, that NATO will remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist. At Lisbon, the Alliance reaffirmed that the strategic nuclear forces of NATO's nuclear-armed member states are, and I quote, the supreme guarantee of the security of the Allies, close quote, and agreed that NATO should maintain the broadest possible level of burden sharing on nuclear matters. NATO allies further agreed to seek to create conditions for future nuclear reductions and noted that the alliance should seek Russia's agreement to increase the transparency of its nuclear weapons in Europe and to relocate those weapons away from the territories of NATO members. We are committed to consulting closely with allies and making decisions by consensus on NATO's nuclear deterrent. The DDPR is examining NATO's overall posture in deterring and defending against the full range of threats to the alliance. The review is to identify the appropriate mix of conventional nuclear and missile defense capabilities that NATO needs to respond effectively to 21st century security challenges. The review also aims to strengthen deterrence as part of our commitment to Allied security. The goal is to complete the review for the May 2012 NATO summit that President Obama will host in Chicago. The DDPR also provides us an important opportunity to consult with allies about nuclear deterrence in future Russia nuclear talks. Those consultations will inform our consideration of next steps with Russia on nuclear reductions. As a step in our bilateral dialogue with Russia, we seek to conduct a broad policy discussion on the various considerations that affect strategic stability. We also hope to deepen this engagement to discuss key concepts and terminology which will become relevant as we prepare to discuss future reductions in strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, including both deployed and non-deployed weapons. We also would like to increase transparency on a reciprocal basis with Russia. We are thinking through such transparency measures and how they might be implemented and are consulting with our NATO allies through the DDPR. I am happy to report that implementation of the New START Treaty is proceeding smoothly since its entry into force on February 5th. The New START Treaty places equal arms limits on both sides, limits that are significantly lower than the levels provided for in the original START Treaty and the Moscow Treaty. The New START Treaty provides us confidence that as Russia modernizes its strategic forces, Russian force levels will not exceed the treaty limits 7 years after entry into force and continuing for the remainder of the treaty's duration. The New START Treaty contributes to our security not only through its limits, but also through its strong verification regime. The treaty provides us greater certainty about the composition of Russia's forces. Its verification regime provides information and access that we would otherwise lack. Without the New START Treaty, our inspectors would not be able to visit Russian strategic weapons bases. To date, we have conducted 13 on-site inspections inside Russia. New START's verification regime enhances predictability and stability with U.S. and Russian nuclear relationship, reduces the risk of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and mistrust. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I look forward to answering any of your questions, and once again, it's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Mr. D'Agostino.
Chairman Terminer, Ranking Member Sanchez, and members of the subcommittee, it's a real honor to be here today and be able to talk to you about the work we're doing in the National Nuclear Security Administration, as well as with our interagency partners on taking care of this vital mission. I also want to thank the committee for your continued support of the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration. We have more than 35,000 men and women across our enterprise working to keep the country safe, protect our allies, and enhance global security. Your leadership and support have made their jobs easier. The President has made strengthening nuclear security and the nonproliferation regime one of his top priorities. Over the last few years, we have worked tirelessly to establish a consensus on U.S. nuclear policy. The commitment of the White House has reinvigorated my entire organization. Furthermore, President Obama's commitment to reverse the decline in investment that took place before he entered office is essential for accomplishing our nuclear security work. This commitment was reflected in the President's 2012 budget request
for the NNSA, and in fact, it was also reflected in his 2011 budget request. And this request reflects an integrated 10-year plan and identifies the funding necessary to ensure the safety, security, and effectiveness of our nuclear stockpile, modernize the infrastructure we need to execute our mission, and revitalize the science, technology, and engineering base that supports the full range of our nuclear security activities. Investments in these capabilities over the next decade is essential, and I cannot overemphasize this point. It will require sustained multi-year support from future administrations and Congress. The stability we have gained from the NPR and the New START has allowed us to plan and use our resources much more effectively. We have a comprehensive stockpile stewardship and management plan that is updated annually and provides a long out-year view on the stockpile, as well as the science and infrastructure and human capital necessary to execute the nuclear modernization work and perform the full range of nuclear security work. I'd like to express my concern, however, that this sense of stability could be eroded given the uncertainties stemming from the reductions Congress is contemplating in the FY12 budget process. These uncertainties directly impact our workforce, our ability to efficiently plan and execute our programs, and ultimately the ability to be successful. In order to plan and execute an integrated, complicated program efficiently, we have developed and received support for the 10-year plan outlined in the 1251 report. However, this consensus for nuclear modernization is facing great uncertainty in the face of today's fiscal challenges and limitations imposed by Congress in the Budget Control Act. This consensus is also under attack by some who are spreading incorrect cost estimates. By using numbers that potentially 3 to 4 times higher than what it would actually cost to modernize and maintain our stockpile, the approach appears to use our current physical environment to potentially tear up the path that the President and Congress have laid out for us. The 1251 report makes clear that the total for the Department of Defense and NNSA will cost approximately $200 billion over the next 10 years, not the $600+ billion or so that some are claiming. It is critical to accept the linkage between modernizing our current stockpile in order to achieve the policy objective of decreasing the number of weapons we have in our stockpile while still ensuring that the deterrent is safe, secure, and effective. As you know, the United States will continue to have nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future, and many of our projects are vital to national security. The longer these projects are delayed, the more expensive they become. Projects like the uranium processing facility and the chemistry and metallurgy replacement facility will allow us to replace aging Cold War infrastructure. And at the other end of the life cycle of these materials, the mixed oxide fuel fabrication facility represents a critical nonproliferation effort that will result in the elimination of enough material for approximately 17,000 nuclear weapons. It is the only permanent plutonium disposition method agreed to by the United States and Russia and has been supported by every President and Congress since the idea was introduced. Our stockpile stewardship program, which allows us to assess and certify the stockpile without returning to underground testing, has grown increasingly important. Our world-class scientific capabilities, for example in modeling, simulation, continue to be developed to realize the stockpile stewardship program today, and today we actually have a greater understanding of how a nuclear weapon behaves than we did during the days of testing. Investing in a modern 21st century enterprise is not just about the stockpile. As the President said in Prague in April of 2009, the threat of a terrorist acquiring and using a nuclear weapon is the most immediate and extreme threat we face. The investments we make today help support the full range of our nuclear security mission, which includes countering nuclear terrorism. As part of our nonproliferation work, we are working to support the International Atomic Energy Agency and assisting many member states around the world in implementing their nuclear nonproliferation treaty obligations. And we're really leveraging the expertise of our physicists, our engineers, and our scientists to advance radiation detection technology and equipment. And we're leading the international effort to implement more stringent standards for the physical protection of nuclear material around the world. Our engineers are also working to complete the design work on the nuclear reactor plant for the Ohio-class replacement submarine. This effort is a continuation of the long-standing unique role NNSA serves in partnership with the United States Navy. I'd like to take a brief moment to answer your question about the anomaly, Mr. Chairman. The anomalies depend, of course, if we anticipate a continuing resolution coming. We know a date is approaching us, 18 November. But the decision on whether to pursue an anomaly involves a couple of factors. One is the length of the anomaly. At this point right now, we don't know if there will be an anomaly, first of all, or if there is one. If there is a continuing resolution, if there is one, how long it will be. A short-term continuing resolution coupled with the second factor, which is what kind of resources do we currently have available to continue our programs without impact to the overall direction that we have. Those two factors are key elements in deciding whether the administration pursues an anomaly. We're working very closely. I'm working very closely with the White House on this question, and as we get closer to the date, we'll be in the position to make a recommendation on this particular point. So it really depends on those two particular factors, of which right now I don't have all of the data on, particularly on the first one, the length of the continuing resolution. But that concludes my statement, sir.
Thank you. To follow on your comment on the anomaly, I certainly understand your answer, and it certainly is a very, very practical and reasonable statement of basically, if you need the money, you'd ask for it, and if you have other ways to either you have the money or it's not needed in the short term, that you might not ask. But I would like you to consider, and all of the witnesses to consider, the message that it sends, because at the same time that the House is looking at cutting, if the anomaly is not requested, it looks as if it's not necessary for the House to fund. And so that might be your third environmental context that you might want to put in as far as your request for anomaly, because it doesn't look like the administration is doing I want it in one hand and a wink in the other by not asking for the anomaly. So if you take that in consideration, and all of you, as you look to recommendations on the anomaly, I'd appreciate that. Because we have so many members in attendance, we want to make certain that we have an ability for people to ask questions. I'm going to ask three questions from my start. Two of which, the first two, are relatively easy because they're commercials. I'm going to ask an opportunity for each of you to give a commercial for us. Mr. D'Agostino, you began actually in your statement addressing what my first concern is of the first of those two where I'm asking for a commercial, and that is the issue of the statements that have been circulating that the U.S. is going to spend over $700 billion of nuclear weapons and related programs over the next 10 years. Mr. Markey circulated a letter signed by 62 members that said that. It was followed on by the New York Times, did an editorial that said the number is $600 billion over the next 10 years. You, in your statement before us just now, said it's slightly over $200 billion that is going to be spent. So I'd like each of you to respond to that issue of the actual cost. The second is, the second part of that is the reason why that's coming about is because we're under these budgetary pressures. And I think there's this false assumption that with budgetary pressures that if there's reductions, there's this great savings that is going to occur. And I try to tell people that, for example, if this room was a nuclear storage facility and you had a nuclear weapon in it, you only had one versus you had 20, you're not going to have less people outside the door. And similarly, I know, Mr. D'Agostino, you tell us about the room down the hall where we have scientists charged with knowledge with respect to nuclear weapons, and knowledge is not something that has a reduced demand based upon the numbers of weapons that we have deployed. So my first question is would you all speak, and Undersecretary Tauscher, you're welcome to chime in on this one also if you'd like, but it's not directed at you, to the issue of that we're not spending $700 to $600 billion, that it's slightly over $200 billion over the next 10 years. And the second aspect of is that policy, not budgetary pressures, should be the focus of reductions, and that the savings are somewhat elusive. They're not as they're being expressed in these calls for reductions. If you might give us some of your wisdom on that, I'd appreciate it. Start with Dr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Section 1251 report that was submitted by the administration included our best estimate of the total costs of sustaining and modernizing the nuclear enterprise and the delivery systems from fiscal year 12 through fiscal year 21. That estimate was $125.8 billion for the delivery systems and about $88 billion for the NNSA-related costs. And my math suggests that is, as the administrator said, a little over $200 billion over that period, close to $214 billion. I had an opportunity to look at some of the materials that were referenced in the cost estimates just before coming over here, and without giving the time, giving this more time than it deserves, suffice it to say there was double counting and some rather curious arithmetic involved.
Would you wish to comment with respect to the issue of savings? Because I think that people really do look at this as a take the number and divide by however many, reduce them, and you have those savings, and that's not exactly the case.
So I would like to comment. Thank you. A strategic approach to the budget overall does not involve taking an equal percentage from every element of the budget. And the Department of Defense certainly is committed to taking a strategic, in a different sense than strategic weapons now, a thoughtful approach, strategy-driven approach to the reductions. We are looking to take north of $450 billion out of the defense program over the next decade. And as a result of that, as Secretary Gates has said and Secretary Panetta has said since, essentially everything is on the table. That doesn't mean everything should get the same treatment. We will look hard at our own spending within nuclear forces to ask where savings could be gained while still producing the same capabilities that we need, just as we're looking hard in other areas. And I know that we will owe another Section 1251 report with a new budget. And the one constant I can promise is that we will continue to propose what we believe is necessary for sustaining a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, including the delivery systems and including the infrastructure, science and technology, and work on weapons that's required.
Thank you. General Kaler.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with both those comments. I too agree with the 1251 report and the $200+ billion that it documented for the need to both sustain and modernize or begin the modernization of the nuclear enterprise over the next 10 years. The second point, and I would agree here totally with Dr. Miller as well, given the magnitude of the first round of budget cuts that the department is dealing with, and certainly that the combatant commanders have been asked to help the services deal with, we're looking for every possible place that we can find that we can be more efficient while we maintain our military capability. And I would say that we have not been immune from that look, nor should we have been immune from that look. I think that Congresswoman Sanchez said this, though, in her opening remarks, that there are decision points that are along the way here that do give us some flexibility in terms of how we ultimately decide to modernize and how we can go forward. So I do think that in addition to looking for every place we can save money, I also agree with you, in some places this is not a one-for-one, take something out and you automatically save some X amount of money. It's a more complicated answer than that. But there are also some key decision points that are coming along where I think that there is still some flexibility to do some shaping.
Mr. D'Agostino, would you like to embellish your comment that you made in your statement?
I would agree with Dr. Miller with respect to the math and the numbers that the administration put out in its 1251 report. Regarding your second question, I'd like to add a little bit if I could. I think it's important to recognize that what we have is a capability-based enterprise. An enterprise, this is a nuclear security enterprise. It's not a nuclear weapons enterprise. It's a nuclear security enterprise. It's an enterprise that, of course, takes care of the deterrent, because the President said as long as weapons exist, we're going to take care of them to make sure they're safe, secure, and effective. But it's an enterprise that does so much more. It's an enterprise that does nuclear nonproliferation in over 100 countries around the world with the State Department. It's an enterprise that does nuclear counterterrorism work with our partners in the intelligence community and the Defense Department. It's an enterprise that does nuclear forensics work as we work with our key allies to make sure that if material is found, we're in the best position to be able to attribute where this material came from. And it's an enterprise that does nuclear emergency response. And nuclear emergency response is something we actually used earlier this year in assisting our Japanese colleagues with the Fukushima event. Those assets, those key assets, came from the account that Congress authorized and appropriates, called the Weapons Activities Account. And in reality, not all of that account, that Weapons Activities Account, is work exactly on the nuclear weapon. It provides that base capability to address all of these other things. One last point, and then I'll yield back. This enterprise, because it's a capability-based enterprise, it can work up and take care of a stockpile size. I mean, it's fairly independent at low numbers, and this is where we are. Jim Miller talked about the number of warheads that we have in our active and inactive stockpile. It is able to take care of that capability, whether you do one or whether you do more than one. you need the same amount of material. And that's the kind of enterprise we have. This is not a Cold War enterprise where we can do thousands and thousands and thousands of warheads, as we did back in the 60s, where we had over 31,000 warheads. It's completely different. But I wanted to make sure the shift we are making in the NNSA and in the administration is to shift the work from a nuclear weapons complex to a nuclear security enterprise, to bring in those other elements, because those are the elements that the President has laid out in the NPR that we feel will be a key national security and global security challenge.
Thank you. And in the second aspect of a commercial, we're all in agreement that the nuclear modernization needs to go forward. I mean, this committee passed in its bill full funding. The administration asked for full funding. We're all facing now the bills that came out of the Senate and the House Energy and Water Appropriations subcommittees, and then that had reductions in funding for the nuclear modernization. So a question, obviously, that people will have is, what's the difference? Is there? What is the effect if the cuts go into place instead of what we all have agreed would be the appropriate level of funding? I'll start with you, Dr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, I'll answer at a general level and leave the technical details to Administrator D'Agostino. At a general level, the first order effects are going to be that the NNSA, with the overall level of funding, would be forced to make very difficult trades between investing in science and technology that's necessary to support the overall efforts that the Administrator described, and the infrastructure that's required to implement those, and to do the life extension programs that the Department of Defense is focused on. And as you look at the level of reductions that have been proposed by both the House and the Senate in appropriations, some essential activities will not be undertaken. If you look within those reductions at the specifics, we have particular concern to the Department of Defense reductions in funding for the B-61 life extension program. That's a critical weapon system for both our bombers and for our dual capable aircraft, and reductions also in the W-78 life extension program, where there are cascading effects. If one program is delayed, the next one is delayed. And again, Mr. D'Agostino can give greater details, but one of those effects is that at the end of the day, the United States gets less product for more cost, because these changes in programs are going to drive up costs overall.
General Kaler?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add that if we're referring specifically to the markups dealing with the Department of Energy and NNSA part of the budget, then I would just add I am very concerned about the impact on life extension programs. I have a concern for the broader enterprise as well, as the Administrator suggested, but we've got some near-term issues that will impact us in terms of life extension programs for aging weapons. In a broader context, though, I also have concerns as budget reductions are related either to our efforts to sustain the existing force or our efforts to modernize the existing force. And we find ourselves at a point in time where several modernization programs have begun. It's important for us to continue to sustain this safe, secure, and effective deterrent force as we transition this time period to future modernization. And of course, I have concerns in both of those areas in the macro sense as we struggle with budget reductions.
Mr. D'Agostino.
Obviously, we have two bills, one from the House, one from the Senate, in both subcommittees. Their marks are different. The House is down overall for the NNSA by $1.16 billion. That's out of about the request of $11 billion or so. So it's a pretty sizable percentage-wise reduction. The Senate reduction is significantly less, $732 million as a result of that. Focus a little bit on the weapons account. I believe that may be where some of your questions come from, but I do want to mention the nonproliferation because that has an impact. The President has laid out a fairly clear message with respect to the desire to secure nuclear material around the world in 4 years, which we believe is absolutely critically important. Both bills marked on the plutonium and uranium facilities, about $150 to $200 million. Those reductions are going to cause us to look very closely. If we end up in somewhere in this region, are going to cause us to have to look very closely at both of those facilities. It doesn't, because we obviously are authorized and appropriated on an annual basis, and the 1251 report makes very clear about out-year commitments and requirements to do this. It's difficult to actually run, in fact, I would say close to impossible to run a large construction project efficiently if every year we will anticipate having huge deltas between the House and Senate and the administration requests, whether it's President Obama's budget request or whatever happens out in the future. It's just a horribly inefficient way to deliver a construction project. Nobody, frankly, I would say in the right mind, would run a program this way. And so we'll have to take a look at what makes sense, balancing what we think Congress will support in the out years, but more importantly, what the requirements are, because the requirements are the things that ultimately will take us in the direction that we believe the nation needs to go into. And the President has been very clear about his requirements, and he's done it with 2 budgets in a row. On the life extension area, both the Senate and the House took different approaches in the life extension area. Essentially, the House largely did not reduce the resources in the directed stockpile work account, which is actually the account that works on the stockpile itself directly, but the Senate took a bit of a more an aggressive approach. That's going to have to get worked out if there is a conference. If things work out, we're going to have to wait and see how that one looks. But I'm with General Kaler on this. We have very real needs with respect to the B-61 warhead. We're looking at it from a strategy standpoint on it being able to address the nation's need out into the future. We don't want to necessarily disarm by, just attrition because we can't agree. We believe this is the right plan, and that's why we have it put forward. This group has spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking to folks, both members and staff, and obviously we're going to continue to need to work with you and others to make sure that there's clear understanding about what the President's put forward in his plan and what the best way to move forward in that area. It's important also to say that reductions in what we call the campaigns, the science campaigns, the computing work, these types of reductions themselves, in one area it's cut by $140 million, in another area it's only cut by $60 million. But this is work that directly supports enabling technologies. This is the work to make sure these technologies are ones that allow us to certify the stockpile on an annual basis without underground testing. Reductions in these areas have a direct impact on the President today in the ability to certify the stockpile without underground testing. We cannot overemphasize that particular point. I should probably just say one thing about nonproliferation and then the naval reactors area before I stop. Unfortunately, I could probably talk for too long on this area. The nonproliferation work we have right now, we're deeply concerned about our ability to convert research reactors worldwide from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium, and 2, having the resources to buy the long lead material, the casks and containers necessary to move highly enriched uranium and plutonium materials from around the world back to the United States or back to Russia where it's in a secure area. We're on the ragged edge, in my opinion, of making it very difficult for us to meet the President's vision here, and I don't think that's good for anybody. The Naval Reactors Program itself, in both cases, has undergone either, depending on how you look at it, a $60 million or $100 million reduction or so. Those reductions, many cases, foreshadow decisions that the Defense Department has already made decisions on the path forward on the need to replace the submarine. So we are responding with the program. This is what this does. And what this does is makes it very difficult, in my opinion, to be able to honor those commitments that the Defense Department is asking us to do. I'll stop there. I think I could go longer, but
I'm going to hold you guys have given such great and excellent answers on those topics, which were very, very important to us. I'm going to hold the rest of my questions to the second round. But before I can, turn it over to the ranking member, Dr. Miller, I got one real quick one for you. In this same vein that you were all commenting, we all know that those cuts coming out of the energy and water appropriations bills affect the fact that Secretary Gates transferred $8.3 billion in DoD top-line budget authority to NNSA over a 5-year period to help the modernization efforts. As you know, the energy and water appropriations bills cut those modernization efforts while adding money to the President's budget requests for water projects. What is DoD's view of that?
Mr. Chairman, let me say on the record that DoD transferred those funds with the expectation and understanding that the resources would go to weapons-related activities. I think I do not want to get into the question of trying to track dollars and proposals that go from the administration over the Hill. But clearly, as we look at the future of NNSA funding and we look at any possibility of DoD transferring additional resources, some of which of the amount you've noted have been withheld in DoD, we would want to have an understanding that the budget provided by Congress was going to be at a level that was, of course, both sufficient but also sustainable over time, so that we can get stability in that program.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The current nuclear force modernization plans call for the Navy to spend around $110 billion to build a new fleet of nuclear-armed submarines. And the Pentagon estimates that the total cost of building and operating the new submarine is going to be about $350 billion over its 50-year lifespan. And the Air Force also intends to spend about $55 billion on procurement of 100 new bombers and an unknown sum on new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. And additionally, the NNSA plans to spend $88 billion over the next decade to refurbish existing nuclear warheads and rebuild the factories that make key nuclear warhead parts. However, U.S. military leaders have stated that our nuclear weapons budget is not grounded in a coherent overall strategy. Former Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Cartwright, noted in July 2011, and I quote him, "We haven't really exercised the mental gymnastics, the intellectual capital on that, what is required for nuclear deterrence, yet I'm pleased that it's starting, but I wouldn't be in favor of building too much until we had had that discussion." That was in July of 2011. Do you agree with General Cartwright that the U.S. shouldn't make major procurement commitments until we establish how many nuclear weapons we need for deterrence? Dr. Miller?
General Cartwright was involved in the, as we began planning for the study that we were talking about earlier, and so his comments about thinking hard about the requirements for deterrence in the future I think are well taken and are something that this administration is working hard on. We intend to have a conclusion by the end of the year. At the same time, the requirement to reconsider what's needed for deterrence, how to best provide stability, what is the best approach for non-proliferation, is something that's got to be done on an ongoing basis, and in fact, Congress should expect future administrations to conduct comprehensive nuclear posture reviews that address those questions, and we can't say that because the world is going to change, therefore we're going to wait until the world stabilizes and stops changing in order to make the necessary investments in our nuclear weapons infrastructure and delivery systems. The figures that you cited for the future SSBN, the Ohio class replacement, would be consistent, although they're very rough estimates at this point, would be consistent with something that that was not not 10-year, not 20-year, not 30-year, but over even a longer period of time. And the fact is that the cost of these systems are significant. The requirement to provide effective deterrence and to have stability is critical to this country. And these investments, while we're looking at every possible means to save costs, these investments are essential enough that they deserve, in my view, they deserve to get serious consideration. And if we can have a stable approach with bipartisan political support over time for a level of investment, we will do the right thing by not just this administration, but by future administrations as well.
General.
And if I may add, I completely agree that our force structure and our force posture need to be strategy-based, and we would argue that every single time the question is asked. Here's what we know. What we know is that at present, we are still looking to sustain our current triad of strategic forces, even as we are looking at the appropriate mixture in there, both to, within the limits of New START, to sustain our military effectiveness, but also to see if we can get some fiscal efficiency out of doing that. We know that the sustainment programs that are underway for those three legs will take those forces to a certain point in time, and this gets back to your question about decision points. What we do know is that as far as we can see into the future, the need for a sea-based leg and the attributes that it brings is going to remain. And so the current Ohio submarine has a finite life. We don't know exactly what year that is. It's probably, the Navy probably can't draw a bright line on the chart and say it's that year. But what we know is that risk will go up as life increases. And so there will have to be a replacement in place at some time, we think in the late 2020s or so. That brings it to today to begin research and development, given acquisition lead times. So in my view, it is not premature to go forward with research and development for a replacement to the Ohio-class submarine, a part of our strategic deterrent that we believe is going to be with us for a very, very long time. That leads to the next one in serial order, which would be the bomber, the B-52s, of course, that have been around since the early 1960s. The Air Force intends to field a new long-range strike platform that will be dual capable, both conventional and nuclear capable. My view is that we should leverage that that's a wise leverage point for us. That decision point is here now, and again, research and development money is underway. That leaves the ICBM, and there is not a decision yet about how to go forward. Those analyses of alternatives are underway. And so I think there are a series of decision points here as we go forward. Some we have reached, some have crossed the threshold, I think, of needing to have investment made starting today. And then there's the part about the warheads that we've been discussing here, as well as some of the other pieces that go with this, command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, other things that make this a credible deterrent.
General, my reason for asking the question was just to put on the record that, in fact, it's fluid and we continue to reassess, and that there are key milestones or break points where we have to make a decision, and that it is a long lead time to get some of this done. But it is a lot of money that we're talking about also. That's why we need to continually address it. And it really leads, I don't know if the other two had any comment on that, but it really leads to my next question about not my next question, but one that I had in here. The whole issue of if we can decide unilaterally that we can reduce the weapons and still be as strong as we need to be, or if we reach a particular point in time in the near future where we can actually sit down with the Russians and decide to reduce even further under despite or according to or whatever the New START, wouldn't that be a smart investment also, to leave those decision points open also?
Ma'am, let me answer first, and I know that each of my colleagues is likely to want to add as well. The Nuclear Posture Review stated that although precise numerical equality or parity is not as important as it might have been during the Cold War, that it was still important to us that Russia join us as we look to further reductions. And indeed, as Undersecretary Tauscher has suggested, our approach is to look towards a proposal that would include strategic, non-strategic, deployed, and non-deployed. The Deterrence and Defense Posture Review is also seeking to have Russian involvement with respect to transparency, movement of weapons, and reductions as well. There's one point that is worth parsing on this, and that is as we look at how to manage the stockpile to support those weapons that are deployed as part of our strategic deterrent and that are forward deployed or forward deployable as well, we do need to take cost into consideration. We need to take reasonable planning for both what we call the technical hedge and the geopolitical hedge into account. The technical hedge is about being prepared to deal with any technological issue that arises with a warhead or delivery system, and the geopolitical hedge being to be prepared for changes in the environment in the future. We need to take those into account, but then we need to, in our view, to have a stockpile, a combined stockpile and infrastructure that's able to support those hedges at a reasonable cost. And just by way of example, President George W. Bush reduced the stockpile from 10,000 weapons to 5,000 during his time. It wasn't a negotiated change. It was a very sensible change that allowed the different scaling for future size of the infrastructure and allowed NNSA to plan along the lines that they are now. So those changes with respect to the stockpile ought to be considered in a different light than the changes with respect to deployed strategic or with respect to forward deployed or forward deployable weapons.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Anybody else want to chime in?
Well, I will very quickly add that, as Dr. Miller said, when the Nuclear Posture Review was completed, the President directed a review of the nuclear requirements in the post-START environment and objectives to consider for future reductions. And specifically, our goals with New START bilateral negotiations with Russia include reducing non-strategic tactical nuclear weapons and non-deployed nuclear weapons, as well as deployed strategic nuclear weapons on ICBMs, SLBMs, and nuclear-capable heavy bombers. When the President wrote in February and certified to the Senate that we would initiate negotiations with the Russian Federation, we also said we would consult with our NATO allies, and that's part of the DDPR consultation that is going on now. And Secretary Clinton also made clear, very clear last year, that allies agreed in the NATO's new strategic concept, which is the previous detailed thought pattern, that any further steps on U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe must take into account the disparity between our stockpiles and the much larger Russian stockpiles of non-strategic nuclear weapons. So we have unilateral steps that the previous administration took, bilateral steps that this administration took. We're talking about strategic, non-strategic, deployed, non-deployed. We're talking about consultations with our allies. So as you can see, this is a very turbulent, not necessarily in a bad way, but lots of activity going on and lots of decision points coming forward based on a lot of consultation and a lot of results in the post-New START implementation phase. So I think that this is a very energetic area. Obviously, it's important that we keep in mind the long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons, but at the same time, what we're specifically talking about today is the investment strategy that gets us a safe and reliable and effective stockpile in the meantime.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back because I know there's a lot of people who want to ask questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. I would extend a special thanks to Undersecretary Tauscher for being here. Having the privilege of serving with her on committees in the past it's just very nice to see you here. So, Ms. Tauscher, in the short time I have, you know how these things are. I hope you'll grant me diplomatic immunity here, but everything I say is in the greatest deference.
Not until I hear the question.
Okay, all right. Well, here goes. See, she's gone went and done it now. In your recent remarks at the Atlantic Council, you stated the following, quote, the Obama administration's approach provided more protection sooner against the existing threat using proven systems at a lower cost than the previous proposal, close quote. Now, I understood that the NBA is developing a brand new interceptor missile, the SM-32B, for that process, which at this point hasn't been developed yet, and a brand new satellite system for precision tracking space system, about which this committee, of course, has already expressed some considerable concerns because of the unproven approach regarding technology. So I guess my first diplomatic question is, can you explain the statement using proven systems in connection with the EPAA, and how do you, help me understand your understanding of these two European phased adaptive approach components?
Well, the EPAA is a huge success, Congressman. It's not only on station and working, but it is using a proven system. As you remember from many years of committee testimony, the EPAA is based on the SM-3 interceptor, which is an over 25-year-old Navy rocket that has been fully tested and tested with great success. It is both a land-based and a sea-based system, as you know, Aegis and Aegis Ashore. And the focus on the now distinguishes our approach from the previously proposed system, which focused on a longer-range missile threat that has been slower to develop, and a system that is still under testing, which is the ground-based interceptor. We already have the Monterey on station, so the EPAA is now actually working. It is now protecting not only our NATO allies, populations, and territories against a proven short, medium, and intermediate range threat, but it also protects American forward deployed troops. We also have finished all three negotiations with Poland, Turkey, and Romania. Actually, the Poland and Turkey agreements are in force, and the Romanian agreement is just about to be ratified by their parliament. So we have the entire system is proposed. It is agreed to by our NATO allies. It is the United States contribution as a national asset to the NATO system, and we're working to NATO-wise the planning and the command and control of that system. So that's pretty much the difference between what was proposed and what is now actually on station and protecting our NATO allies and forward-based American troops.
Well, let me shift gears here a little bit. Your legislative affairs staff was asked to provide the committee the basis for the statement at a lower cost than previous proposal. When could this committee receive that information?
Well, I didn't understand that you hadn't received it, but I think that we certainly will endeavor to get it to you very quickly. The proposal for the EPAA is one that you've not only passed through this committee, but you've also voted on. So I assume it's something that meets with your approval, but it is at lower cost than the previous system, not only because the previous system was out into the future, but because we use systems, including Aegis system, that is a multi-purpose system. So it has cost benefits as opposed to systems that just rely on ground-based interceptors.
Well, thank you. Dr. Miller, I'm going to try to get through this one here quickly. We're about running out of time here. Regarding the EPAA, the committee's majority has stated its concerns that the current budget environment, it may not be possible to provide for Europe's missile defense through the EPA and homeland defense of the United States. And part of this is, of course, understanding the actual cost of the EPAA, which the administration has, it appears, is generously offered to Europe free of charge, and essentially to be a U.S. contribution to the defense of Europe. At the same time, the administration, the previous majority in the House and the Senate majority, cut funding significantly for GMD systems by $1.6 billion in President Obama's 3 years in office. When Chairman Langevin and Representative Turner wrote to the GAO and asked for a comprehensive review of EPAA, the GAO responded, quote, "We found that the DoD has not fully implemented a management process that synchronized EPAA acquisition activities and ensured transparency and accountability. The limited visibility into costs and schedule for EPAA reflect the oversight challenges with the acquisition of missile defense capabilities that we have previously reported. Now, since then, the committee has told us that the EPAA approach and content has matured significantly since this document was developed. So, and we've already talked about PTSS. We've already talked about the SM-3-2B missile, which it appears the 2009 assumptions have been essentially changed dramatically. So I guess my question to you, and I'll just throw it out here quickly, Dr. Miller, and to you, Ms. Tauscher, can you provide to this committee by, say, the end of the month, a comprehensive soup to nuts whole of the federal government cost for each phase of the EPAA?
Sir, we've included in the Missile Defense Agency budget submission the key elements of EPA as in terms of our best estimate over this coming year and over the future defense program. One of the issues that I think may have possibly confused the GAO is that the EPAA, the European Phase Adaptive Approach, while it includes 2 fixed sites, the Aegis Ashore sites in Poland and Romania, and includes the fixed radar in Turkey, which, as Undersecretary Tauscher has noted, are all agreed, relies very heavily on mobile systems, and these mobile systems would be available globally and on Aegis ships. And the SM-3 1A missile that we have in the force today is a proven technology with a very strong record of testing. The TIPI-2 radar is a proven technology with a very strong record. The phases of the system were defined by the steps that we intended to take to bring additional capability to bear, and predominantly defined by the next types of missiles from 1A to 2A. I'm sorry, from 1A to 1B to 2A to 2B. And so we knew that there was going to be technological growth in the system, and that would improve its capabilities. It's also important to understand that the costs of the system are shared. For NATO, there's the ALT-BMD system for command and control. That is NATO shared costs. For the SM-3-2A missile, we're co-developing it with Japan. And so it is true that we are devoting significant resources to the phased adaptive approach for Europe. It's also true that the investment in the systems that will help on EPAA will also be valuable for a scenario in Northeast Asia or for a scenario in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. Finally, very briefly, with respect to your question of the national missile defense, the administration remains fully committed to the defense of the nation against limited missile attacks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Mr. Langevin?
Is this on? I think it's on. There we go. Thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to have the panel before us, and especially I want to welcome back Secretary Tauscher. It's obviously wonderful to see you back here with us, as always, and we miss you in the House, of course, but we are certainly glad to have your leadership at State and your guidance first from this subcommittee and now in the administration have really been obviously invaluable to our nation, and I just want to again thank you for all your work. And if I could then, Madam Secretary, I will start with you. Could you please comment on the status of implementation of the new START treaty to date? Can you tell us how much data have the two sides exchanged with each other's about each other's nuclear forces? How many on-site inspections has the U.S. performed in Russia? Can you share any information on what we've learned about Russia's nuclear arsenal as a result of the treaty that we would not know if the treaty were not in force?
Thank you, Congressman, and it's always my pleasure to be back here. As you know, we have implemented the treaty, and the treaty is, we're doing our exchanges and our inspections. We have had a number of them in the very short term. We have a question right now of me finding the page that tells me all the numbers, which is right here someplace. But we have a significant record right now in the New START treaty. Right now we have, as you know, the New START limit of 700 deployed ICBMs, SLBMs, and nuclear-capable bombers will allow the United States to retain the current 14 SSBNs. We have 56 SLBM launchers not deploying SLBMs, but an additional 40 launchers. So we have, I think, in the last number of months, we've had 7 or 8 exchanges that have brought to us a significant amount of information. As we said repeatedly during the ratification process of New START, this is not only about bringing us down to lower levels, but it's also about the fact of access. If we didn't have the New START treaty, it was likely that both countries would have reduced weapons, but very unlikely that we would have been able to verify it. So the verification regime that is part of New START and the compliance regime that is part of New START, much of it that is adding new technology and new ways for us to improve the accounting rules so that we have much greater assurance that this weapon that we see this time is the weapon that we see the next time. All of that information is vitally important to the kind of assurance that we get here in the United States about what the Russians are doing, what they get when they come to see us. But I think what's most important, too, is that it's important for the two great nuclear powers to be able to do this so that the world sees what we're doing. So we're able to also reassure everyone else that we have these inspections. As I said, we've had 8 or 9 inspections back and forth, and I think that we're expecting new inspections. Do you know what the next date is, by any chance?
I don't have the next date, but if I could suggest that we provide the data for the record, my recollection is that we've conducted 13 and the Russians have conducted 12 inspections.
Right?
We've done 2 data exchanges and had 2 meetings of the Bilateral Consultative Commission. And because these are occurring almost real time,
That's right.
If we could provide something for the record, I think it would be terrific.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then let me now open it up to the question up to the panel. The House version of the FY 2012 NDAA includes a provision, Section 1055, that would delay force reduction under New START until the Secretaries of Defense and Energy certify that the plan to modernize the nuclear weapons complex and delivery systems is being carried out. The provision also limits reductions in the stockpile of the U.S. warheads held in reserve until several conditions are met. In particular, 2 new facilities, the Chemistry and Metallurgy Research Replacement Nuclear Facility and the Uranium Processing Facility must be operational, which will not be until at least 2024. Finally, Section 1055 prevents any unilateral reductions below the limits contained in New START. Now, a statement of administration policy threatened to veto the final bill if it includes this provision. Could you elaborate on how these conditions could prevent the Pentagon from implementing New START?
Thank you, sir. I'd be glad to offer some examples. The requirement not to make any reductions until CMRR and UPF is in place, as you noted, would push the timeline for those reductions into the 2020s. The requirement under the New START Treaty is to make all reductions within a 7-year period after the entry into force of the treaty, so that would become infeasible. If it's applied only to reductions in the stockpile, if the requirement for CMR and UPF is interpreted to apply only to making reductions in the nuclear stockpile, what that would then mean is that the administration would be required to sustain a level of the stockpile through to the mid-2020s, irrespective of the requirements for a geopolitical hedge or a technical hedge, and at additional cost to the government. In an era of limited budgets, what that would mean is that less is going to something else. So it may mean less science and technology.
Just a second, please, if I could interrupt for just a moment. That the second point that you're making is not a New START Treaty issue, correct?
The second point is not. It's
right. I want to make that clear because the language actually that's in that provision clearly limits it to non-deployed. So it would be the second that you're talking about, which is not a New START. And I think his question was, how does it affect our New START compliance, and that surely wouldn't.
So let me focus on the second part. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issue with respect to the stockpile is, as I said, that the provision would require this administration, the next administration, the administration after that, to sustain a stockpile at the present level, at additional costs, and irrespective of the geopolitical and technical requirements. If that provision had been in place under President George W. Bush, we'd have a stockpile of 10,000 instead of 5,000 today. It would be excess to need for national security, and it would be something that in an era of limited budgets that we would be wasting resources. And it's the question of no unilateral reductions below the levels of the New START Treaty. I think is worth considering in two parts. The first is that if the interpretation is that the United States must maintain precisely no fewer than 1,550 accountable deployed nuclear weapons under the New START Treaty, one gets into a question of if it makes more sense because of the specifics of how, to take one example, how SSBNs are loaded, to have slightly fewer to allow a balanced loading of our SSBNs. That's something that would be precluded. So to be required to hit 1,550 on the nose doesn't necessarily make operational sense. And the second element and a critical element for the administration is that it is going well beyond what the Senate had in the resolution of ratification. The resolution of ratification said that any militarily significant reductions below New START levels should be, I'll paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me, but should be negotiated and brought back for the consent and advice of the Senate. Understand that requirement. Understand that militarily significant changes should come back up to the Senate, back to the Congress. But to say that it has to be a specific number exactly can be under the treaty can be no more, under this law could be no less, would tie the hands of the commander and of the president, and to say no reductions, no changes whatsoever would be allowed raises, we believe, constitutional issues.
Good. Mr. Chair, I don't know if the rest of the could respond in kind for the record if the time doesn't permit right now.
That'd be great. And we also have a second round if you want to revisit the issue.
Okay.
Mr. Lamborn.
All right, thank you. Continuing this discussion, you heard the chairman mention Condition 9B of the Senate resolution to ratification. And do you all agree that the U.S. should go to the point of reconsidering remaining a party to the New START Treaty if indeed we do not have the dollars the president, and this is to the president's credit, he asked for the dollars for modernization in the fiscal year 2012 in NSA budget. And I'd like all of you to respond to that.
Two parts to the answer, sir. The first is that we understand the requirement to report if we have less funding than in the Section 1251, as requested in the Section 1251 report. Our interpretation of that has been substantially less. There was, in fiscal year 11, it was actually slightly less was appropriated than requested. Our judgment was that 1% or less change didn't require us to submit the report. The difference we're looking at now in both the House and the Senate appropriations bill, I think, would trigger that, and we would have to examine that question. We entered into New START Treaty because it was in our national security interest. We have the right to withdraw from that treaty as a country, and we should. And in principle, this is an issue that should be considered whenever the security conditions arise that would require it. So we will. If there's substantially less funding than requested, we will, of course, provide the report to Congress.
And, sir, I would just add that understanding what the language requires, I would form my recommendation in this regard based upon my assessment of whether we could perform the military mission that is being asked of us. And given a certain number of weapons and type of weapons that we have, understanding, again, that there are some trigger conditions here for reporting, I would form my assessment based upon the force that we have and whether we can execute the missions. And as long as we can execute the missions, then my recommendation would be that we would continue to go forward.
Are you saying, General, that you would not take into account whether or not dollars were added to our budget for modernization?
I would most certainly take that into account. But I would be asked to provide a today recommendation, and I would base that recommendation on whether or not we could execute the mission that we were being asked to perform. If a budget reduction was resulting in some decline in that mission as we could look to the future, then I would offer my judgment accordingly.
I think that there's been a co-joining of these two issues for quite a long time, and in my opinion, it's been almost a red herring. Who's not for modernization of the forces? The President has made clear he is. The President has put a tremendous amount of increase of budget. He's talked about it for years. So the President has said what he wants to do. He's put the money in the budget, and now it's up to the Congress to provide the money. That's where we seem to be having the problem.
That's right. And I said...
Not with the President.
No, exactly. And I said to the President's credit, the House and Senate has not, however, followed up in the current status of both appropriation bills.
That's right. But the New START negotiations were already something that was considered previous to the end of the START Treaty, which expired in December of 2009. And when we achieved those limits, way before the end of the START Treaty, by the way, subsequently we had the Moscow Treaty that President Bush came through. And that was a unilateral decision to decrease forces. General Kaler is really the person with the Strategic Command and the National Command Authority and the DOD and the DOE that are going to look to make sure that he has what he needs. You also have the President and the lab directors that have to certify the capability, effectiveness, safety, and reliability of the stockpile every year. So there are different components here that all add into the question of, does the President as Commander-in-Chief have what he needs in order to not only deter and defend the United States, but to those countries to whom we extend our deterrence? Do we have the capability to do that? And so the decision was made to modernize the NNSA and the force, and to make sure that we had at lower levels the kind of numbers that were going to be able to be agreed to by General Kaler and certified by the lab directors, and to satisfy the President's concern that we have what we need. And there's a very significant process to that. It includes the nuclear post review. As we've discussed, it also includes dealing with our allies on the DDPR. So there are many components to this. It's not just one or the other. It's not just if you have this, then if you don't have this, you don't get that. So I think that you have to look at this in a very holistic way. You have to look at it more than just the simple boiling down of, if you don't have modernization, can you actually keep the New START Treaty? We've agreed to the New START levels. We've done that. Assuming that we're going to get the funding, assuming that we're going to have modernization, assuming that we're going to have lower levels and that we're going to be able to certify. But I think that, just saying if you don't have one, you don't have the other, I think almost misses the point of a very, very sophisticated strategy that numerous presidents have been working with that have put us in a position where we do have a very safe and reliable stockpile, one that General Kaler can tell you is going to meet the military requirements.
Well, Undersecretary Tauscher, am I wrong in assuming that if we don't have the dollars for modernization, then we can't rely on the lower numbers of weapons that New START calls for?
I don't believe so. I believe that this is not a zero-sum game.
So we could disarm through attrition, like Tom was saying?
I don't know how you get to that assumption. What I'm saying is everybody's for doing what we've agreed to do. The question is, where do we get the money? The President has made very clear that he wants to have major investments in the NNSA, the stockpile, and human capital, and refurbishing the enterprise to make it more responsive to the reality of lower numbers. And that is what we're going to have. We have not exactly what the President has asked for in the budget, but we're not at zero. This is not, a super tanker where you hit the brakes and you stop on a dime. This is going to take a while for the fact that we don't have this money to affect the system. Will it affect the system? Yes. Will we be able to get what we need? No. Is it wrong to assume that these cuts are fungible and that we can live with them? No. But at the same time, it's not true that we endanger our ability to go to lower levels tomorrow because we don't have the budget numbers that the Congress is meant to give us and agree with the President's numbers.
Okay, we're going to have to continue this discussion, especially after we see what the appropriations process yields. And my very last thing, Undersecretary Tauscher, is, and I'll just conclude with this because we're starting to run out of time. Is this administration contemplating any unilateral cuts or any other further cuts at all in U.S. nuclear warheads, platforms, delivery vehicles, or capability?
Well, as I told you, the President agreed in his letter to Senator Reid and Senator McConnell late last year during the consideration of New START by the Senate in the lame duck session that, this year we would begin to work with the Russians on deployed, non-deployed, strategic, non-strategic. I have my counterpart in what's called the Ryabkov-Tauscher channel. We have already sat down and started to have conversations with them about the kinds of framework for future reductions, both, as I said, on strategic and non-strategic, deployed and non-deployed. We have had conversations with the P5 on different things, including verification and the new kind of technology and the new science involved in that. So I don't make the policy, I just go off and do it. But previous administrations have made the decision to do that. I don't know of anything that the President has said where he has said that he is considering unilateral cuts. So I will tell you that my mission is to talk to the Russians and to continue what we did in New START and also to talk in a multilateral range with the P5.
Thank you. I yield back.
We'll come back. Mr. Garamendi.
I want to thank all of you for a fascinating discussion about where we are with the nuclear security. Mr. Miller, you dismissed those who said that numbers are bigger as bad math and faulty assumptions. Could you please be very specific, not now, but in writing, as to the math and the assumptions so that everybody can get it straight?
Yes, sir. And our first submission is the Section 1251 report that we provided to Congress for our estimates.
Okay.
And if I could give one quick example.
Please, I only have a few moments.
Okay, quick example.
There are assumptions that were made, numbers that were put.
Yeah.
You say they're bad math. I assume they are. Just tell me how. Okay? Now.
Will do.
Thank you. This discussion is almost occurring in a vacuum. Sequestration is out there. Whether there's sequestration or not, there are very significant cuts being discussed for the military. It's like a stovepipe here. We're only discussing the nuclear security in this context, and there are other things that are going on within the military. And it's frankly driving me crazy that all of this happens and we don't know how we're going to put this together, and we may have like a month and a half to put something together. The people around this town that think about these things, think tanks from the left and the right, have thought about the nuclear security issue over the years and have made recommendations from the left of about, I don't know, $135 billion of cuts over the next 2 years, and from the right, a little less than $100 billion. Exactly 104 from the Cato Institute and 139.5 from the Sustainable Defense Task Force. That's the left and the right. how does that figure into what we're doing here? Basically, I heard you say we're tied up by treaties, but apparently within that treaty there are some opportunities. I guess what I'm looking at is I'd like to know what's really viable. No cuts at all? Or if there are going to be cuts in the military, where does this particular portion of the military fit? And what is viable? You know, ranges from, okay, we don't need a triad, or we don't need all of those missiles, or we don't need all of those new bombers right now. We can wait, we can wait. At some point, it's going to have to get beyond, gee, it's going to be terrible. If we have to make cuts, we're going to have to say, here's what can actually happen. And I'm waiting for that information. And you've got 1 minute and 53 seconds to share it.
Mr. Garamendi, thank you. As I said earlier, the Defense Department is looking at north of $450 billion in cuts over the next decade, and a good fraction of those in the next 5 years. Nuclear delivery systems, which are funded out of DoD, are not off the table for that discussion, and we're looking hard at what the core requirements are and the timing of those requirements as well. So, and that is true for each leg of the triad, and it's true as it's true across the board. That the Secretary Panetta has talked about these reductions being hard but manageable. I can confirm that they're hard, and as I said, no element of the Department of Defense budget is off the table from examination.
And here's my point. And I said this earlier to the chiefs. Terrific. And I know that eventually you will tell us what it is. By my count, we have 1 month and a few days before December 23rd, at which point we are by law to make some decisions. May very well our decision is to not make a decision, and we'll just change the law, which we could do. But assuming we actually follow the law, we need to make a decision. So when will you share with us that information? Are we talking about maybe the 22nd of December?
Sir, I think it is fair to say that's a question that's above my pay grade. I'll take it back to my bosses.
I took it to your bosses about 3 hours ago. I'm taking it to you. I guess I'm taking it to the chairman of our committee here, is that at some point along the line, we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And the sooner we have that information, the more thorough the debate will be, and quite possibly the better the result. But ignorance is not a good way to proceed, and we're proceeding with a high level of ignorance, despite what you've said. Now, you've all talked about it, but you've not given us one piece of information about what a cut could be in your area, other than it's going to be bad. I'll let it go at that.
Dr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel today. Y'all are definitely studied up on the issue, and I appreciate that. We've been talking about math here, and I'm going to ask you about a little different math, General Kaler and Mr. Miller. If the Navy and STRATCOM are comfortable with 192 launchers on 12 SSBN-X submarines based on the assumption that New START levels will be those required in 2027 and beyond, meaning 48 fewer launchers than suggested for the submarine-based deterrent in the original 1251 plan, what other reductions are needed to the ICBM and bomber legs to comply with the New START limits?
Sir, thank you. What we have previously said was that we aim toward a New START force structure of 240 SLBM launchers, up to 420 ICBMs, and up to 60 bombers. We, in the context of the budget situation in which we find ourselves, we are looking hard at those numbers again, and in fact want to be informed by the study, this NPR implementation study that is underway. I think it is worth noting that that the size of the number of SLBM launchers that you described would provide a very significant number of warheads that could be deployed, and that would allow the SLBM leg to still account for 2/3 of the overall strategic arsenal.
Sir, I would just add that I think this is another one of those areas where it's helpful to me anyway to separate this into two sets of questions. One is, how will we structure today's force to get into the central limits of the New START treaty? And that's one set of issues that we are working our way through, and that gets to the 240 up to 420 and 60 in terms of the three legs of the triad. We've been looking very hard because we're allowed to mix within the 1,550 deployed warheads that we're allowed and the up to 700 operational delivery vehicles that we're allowed. We're allowed to mix that force in many, many other ways, and so we've been looking whether or not there are alternative force mixtures that preserve a triad, that keep our military effectiveness, and that maybe are more financially efficient. So we are looking, that was certainly a baseline that we departed from, but we're looking to see if there are other ways to go at that mixture. The next question then becomes, for questions of modernization, beyond this current force structure, how should we go about looking at follow-ons, the Ohio replacement, for example? And we have looked at various types of or numbers of tubes that might be on a replacement. The requirement from Stratcom has been, we've looked at both 16-tube variants, we've looked at 20-tube variants. My number one issue is we must be able to get a replacement platform, and therefore affordability has to be an issue here. What we don't have to make a decision on today is what the ultimate number of submarines is that we might have to deploy depending on the world situation that we find as we go to the out years. So my view is I have been comfortable with talking about submarines like they were talked about in the 1251 report and elsewhere that could have 16 tubes, provided we have enough to put to sea to meet our needs, and given that we may make different decisions as we go forward. Our successors, 2 or 3 removed, may decide that's not the right number of submarines as we go forward. To me, it has to be survivable, it has to be affordable, because we have to have it.
All right, let me simplify this a little bit for my understanding and for everyone here. So you're saying that it may be a financially driven decision to go below the understood limits, and in doing so we can compensate in other areas with other launch devices, other platforms. And are you also saying that over time, in out years, we can actually mix that up? That's fluid, we can move back and forth within those, the total New START limits?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And plus we're making a big assumption here that the current limits in New START will in fact carry beyond the 10-year term of the treaty, plus another 5-year extension. We're beyond that, even when we're talking about a follow-on submarine platform, for example. So I think preserving flexibility, preserving our ability to make judgment as we go forward, but committing now to the fact that we must invest in the research and development, we must proceed with these modernization efforts at this point in time with the idea that we can make adjustments as we go to the future, I think is the most prudent thing for the security of the country.
Anyone else would like to add to that at all? Just one other quick thing. Are the full cost of eliminating, converting from deployed to non-deployed and converting to non-nuclear status DoD systems known by the Department at this point?
The answer is they are not, sir, not to my knowledge. That is something we are still working our way through to include, as you know, in the number of launchers that we count. We talked about, Undersecretary talked about the 2 data exchanges we've done with the Russians to date. Our numbers look high, and they look high in some respects because we are still counting what we would term as phantoms. ICBM silos that have already been deactivated but still remain technically on the books for us. Airplanes that are in the boneyard at Davis-Monthan down in Arizona that need to come off the books as well. Those costs are still being worked. We know we have those costs to bear. The services know they have those costs to bear, and we are working our way through how we'll address those, unless there's something more.
General Keller is exactly right. I would just add that the New START treaty has more flexible provisions for the elimination or conversion of systems than was the case under the previous START treaty. And we have asked for estimates from the Air Force and Navy for the alternative approaches, and include the lowest cost approach consistent with the treaty for the elimination of ICBMs, for the elimination of bombers or conversion of bombers, and for the conversion of SLBM tubes, which amounts to taking them off the books. And we are taking. We have some. I've seen some initial estimates, but we've sent them back for re-estimates, and we're looking to drive those numbers down as low as possible.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Miller, you had spoken about the provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act, from which some the administration had threatened to veto. And I want to walk through some of those issues because, as you know, in the discussion, we believed that we were just codifying the administration's policy, that the administration's stated policy would be X, and so we thought we'd put it in the legislation. Now, I understand you're not wanting it in legislation, but I'm concerned as to why you'd go to the level of, the administration would go to the level of arguing for a veto over what appears to be its own policy. So I thought we could have a discussion on whether or not these issues remain administration policy. Before I do that, I want to disagree with you for a couple moments on the issue of your interpretation of those provisions. With respect to the provision that we have in the National Defense Authorization Act that ties modernization to reduction, you had said of your concern that it might be an impediment to our implementation of New START within the requirements of New START. Well, there is a provision that permits a waiver, and it's a waiver that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Energy may sign. So the administration has the ability to waive it if it saw it as an impediment. So I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily persuaded by the argument that it would prevent us from complying with New START. The second thing that you had said is the issue of, what if we had some operational issues that kept us going under the 1550 and how that would be a concern. The numbers requirement of the legislation that we have in the NDAA says that the President may not retire, dismantle, or eliminate, or prepare to retire, dismantle, or eliminate. Operational issues are not retiring, operational issues are not dismantling, and they're not eliminating. So the only reductions that we have in here that might be viewed as a restraint are not certainly ones that you'd run into as just operational. And with respect to the new facilities, and with respect to the hedge, those are the chemistry and metallurgical research replacement facility in New Mexico and the uranium processing facility in Tennessee. Having those operationals before we do further reductions, and I believe that that's been the administration's policy, that was an actual need that we had to have those facilities up before further reductions were taken. But my questions go to you, not to the issues of whether or not we should have this in legislation. I understand you say you'd prefer it not. My questions go, are these things still administration's policy? We've got 4 of them. The first is, when the administration came forward and requested a New START to be ratified, the premise was that the reduction would be taken in concert with modernization, meaning that they could not be separated, that in fact modernization had to be done in order to justify the lowered numbers. Is that still the administration's view, or does the administration believe that we can just go to this number and modernization is irrelevant to the reductions?
The administration view is that both modernization and the New START treaty remain in the national security interest of the United States.
Great, and that's what we put in legislation, so we wanted to confirm it was still the policy since we're facing a veto threat.
Mr. Chairman, let me add, each of them remains in the national security interest of the United States. Both of them together are strongly preferred. So you say, what happens if we have somewhat less than the requested funding under the 1251 report? Does that mean we should withdraw from the New START treaty? I think the answer is...
And that wasn't my question, but go ahead and answer that one.
Well, the answer is we are going to be obliged to provide a report on that question But the New START treaty has benefits to the United States, including the 18 on-site inspections per year, the exchange of data, and the ability to have a much better understanding of Russian strategic forces than we otherwise would. So withdrawing from it would not be without other costs.
The next issue goes to the issue of reducing without the hedge. Our provision is that the chemistry and metallurgical research facility in New Mexico, uranium processing facility in Tennessee, that they need to be operational. President Obama's National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, said at the Carnegie Endowment earlier this year, in fact, if Congress approves the President's funding program for the nuclear complex, it allows us to reduce the size of our nuclear stockpile because we'll be able to maintain a robust hedge against technical problems with a much smaller reserve force. We had put in the legislation that these two facilities had to be operational. Obviously, if they're not operational, they're not contributing to the hedge. Is it now the administration's policy that they're not necessary for further reductions in the hedge?
The administration continues to strongly support the CMRR and UPF facilities. The issue on the provision, and it's in, I believe it's 1055, says that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Energy may not retire, dismantle, or eliminate, or prepare to retire, dismantle, or eliminate any deployed strategic or non-strategic nuclear weapon until the date, that is 90 days after certification, that these facilities are fully operational. And so I'll just read it. I mean, because do you have it in front of you? It says the Department of Energy to retire, dismantle, or eliminate, or prepare to retire, dismantle, eliminate any non-deployed strategic or non-strategic weapon until the date that is 90 days after the date. Mr. Chairman, is a B-52 bomber that is no longer operational and is considered in this category?
But first of all, the reason I'm reading it is because your answer used the word deployed, and this clearly does not say deployed. And I'm not going to argue over what deployed and non-deployed means, other than to reflect that the language of the legislation is non-deployed.
So there's a semantic question that we would need to clarify, and that is, and this is a relatively small issue, is whether the intent of the House is to have this apply to nuclear warheads only or to delivery systems. Frankly, I've heard both of those explanations. That's a relatively smaller issue. It's important, but I would hope that the intent was nuclear warhead. If that is the case, then what it says is that given the timelines, if we have received full funding, the timelines for making CMRR and UPF operational, it means that there may be no retirement, dismantlement, or elimination of non-deployed weapons until the mid-2020s. Is that something that makes sense for the country? I think that my guess is, my strong view actually, is that the answer is likely to be no.
Well, and I believe that actually had reflected the administration's policy. But with respect to the issue of clarifications, considering that this is going into conference, I'd love to work with you on any language that you think would be necessary to clarify that for you, so we don't have language that's confusing.
Sir, could I just make clear, the policy is to look to shift from a reliance on non-deployed warheads to a reliance on infrastructure over time. That is indeed the objective and policy of the administration. And
that is those two facilities.
But it involves more than that. But the policy is not to avoid dismantling, eliminating, or preparing to retire, dismantle, eliminate any non-deployed weapon until the time that all those investments are complete. Indeed, the cost, that would be, I guess, to use a term usually used elsewhere, that would be a cost-imposing strategy on the NNSA.
Yeah, maybe if I could just jump in on that just a little bit. Clearly, the idea of including the word non-deployed in the sentence, or even preparing to retire, dismantle, or eliminate, the reality is we move these systems with the Defense Department from a non-deployed to deployed status all the time. We are constantly doing surveillance, which includes destructive surveillance, which actually means, in effect, we would be coming back to the secretaries, both secretaries, with a bit of a bureaucratic, I would say ponderous bureaucratic process that would slow down and render some significant inefficiencies in my line of work. I won't speak for how it would impact the Defense Department on their delivery systems. So I don't particularly care for the language at all, because it adds a level of bureaucracy that I believe is unnecessary, because we've proven our ability to work with the Defense Department on moving systems back and forth in order to meet the national needs at the particular time. And I just think it's extra work. It's unnecessary. As Jim was talking about.
And you don't think the exception that says activities determined by the Secretary of Defense be necessary to ensure the continued safety, security, and reliability is a big enough umbrella of your activities to exempt? Because I mean, clearly the intent is, it's not dismantle meaning we're cleaning. It's dismantle meaning it's not being put back together. Or eliminate, that's pretty clear. Retire, I think that's pretty clear. I'd be glad to work with you on language for that exception, but I certainly understand your concern.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Miller, we had a conversation on the telephone today, which I greatly appreciated, concerning the issue of nuclear weapons targeting and doctrine and the ongoing review. We referenced as a great starting point the fact that you were a professional staffer on this committee and participated in the 1990s when those type of activities were ongoing, and an expectation on behalf of the committee that your knowledge of what exchange between staff and the administration is expected would be the benchmark point for us looking to a satisfactory exchange between the administration and this committee. I know we have the letter from Secretary Panetta indicating that there will be an exchange between the committee. I know you're taking back to the administration our benchmarking of your participation when you were a staff member as being a level of exchange that we're expecting now that you are in the administration. So we appreciate your level of experience and expertise that you get to take to that discussion. And I understand from your answer that you're going to be endeavoring to get us clarification of that.
Mr. Chairman, I will ask for a clarification. I will say that the language of the letter speaks for itself in a sense in terms of what the Secretary has proposed we do, and I will ask his guidance on the additional questions that you've asked.
Great. I appreciate that, because again, back to our conversation on the phone, it's reading this letter in light of our discussion of what your experience was. We don't have confidence that it's the same, and we would want the treatment of the committee to be the same with you in the administration as it was when you were with the committee. Thank you. Undersecretary Tauscher, you and I have had conversations before about the NATO Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, and I've appreciated both the exchange that we've had and your expertise. I am, as you know, very concerned on the issue of what will count as a reduction. You've, in your answer here today, I think very clearly stated that you looked to reductions, if there were to be reductions with respect to our NATO's nuclear posture or our European U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, that you would see that as tied to a response from Russia. And I would like some assurances from you that you agree that mere geographic relocation of Russian tactical nuclear weapons is neither a reduction nor a significant Russian action for addressing the threat to Europe posed by Russia's thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. As I indicated, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly said in its resolution, which we'll provide you a copy of, that they do not view mere geographic relocation as a reduction. And I'd like to know if you agree.
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only question I had is to allow the other members of the panel to respond to my question with respect to Section 1055 and how those conditions could prevent the Pentagon from implementing New START. So, Secretary Tauscher, I know that you have to leave. If you want to respond to me in writing, that's fine. If if you can just answer, the rest of the panel, if you could just take that right now, that would be helpful.
Sir, again, I would just say, from my perspective, the issue of whether or not the funding would be sufficient to cause us to invoke a withdrawal from the treaty, my view is that it's about risk. And my perspective here is that ultimately I would be asked, and I believe that I should provide, my military advice on whether or not the force as it is constituted could accomplish the job at hand. But there are some risk points along the way. And as we began to get to some of those risk points, for example, we have issues today about, with the current level of funding that's been allowed through the congressional marks, whether our air-delivered weapons can go through life extension. I think that's a risk point that we would have to assess, and I think it would go on from there. So that would be my comment.
Okay, thank you. Secretary.
In our role in supporting the warfighter and in supporting General Kaler's organization, that's ultimately the job that I have in supporting the Defense Department, is to make sure they have the systems they need. I would be concerned, though clearly it's not my area of work, but I'd be concerned as things change, as concerns with our ability essentially maybe to extend the life of a particular system comes up and it becomes an issue. The Defense Department would be in a position to say, how do I change the mix of warheads necessary in order to keep the nation safe and to meet our commitments to our allies as well. And therefore, this provision, in my view, would say, well, we can't do that until after these two facilities are completed. I don't believe that's the intent. Ultimately, the intent might not be the intent of the committee, but it does place a restriction on our ability and the warfighter's ability to say, this is the kind of mix that he or she might recommend to the President, and then ultimately my ability to support that.
Very good.
Sir, if I could just add one more piece to this. There are really two fundamental things that I'm asked to do on a recurring basis. One is I'm asked to comment on my view of the ability of the stockpile and the safety, security, effectiveness of the stockpile. And so every year I provide my assessment of the stockpile. That's one place where I can make my viewpoints known as the combatant commander for the investment that we make in the stockpile, not only in the life extension programs, but in things like surveillance and basic science and the other things that go with that. So in one place, I would have an opportunity to comment on what I thought funding was doing to the overall health of the stockpile. In the other place, I have a commitment, essentially, to be able to tell the President whether or not the force as it is currently constituted is capable of performing the fundamental mission here. And the fundamental mission is deter nuclear attack on the U.S. and our allies, assure our allies, et cetera. And so I am constantly looking at whether or not the force as it is constituted is capable of performing the job that we are being asked to do. As we would get to these decision points where funding would begin to impact that, I'm obligated to stand up at that point and say whether or not I think that either the stockpile is impacted or overall whether we're able to perform the mission that we can, and I would be prepared to do that.
Very good. Secretary Tauscher, did you have anything to add? Or?
I'll just agree with my colleagues. I think that there's the issue of funding for the complex modernization and then the limitations on nuclear forces contained in the House bill. I think that there's some things that I just want to make very clear. The first is that this administration is following through on all of its commitments on modernization. Modernization, as I said earlier, is in the same room with the New START Treaty and what the New START Treaty reductions will do. But they are linked tangentially. They're not specifically linked. It's not one for one. We didn't go into the New START Treaty saying that unless we got this money, we would not go forward with these reductions. The reductions are based on the Nuclear Posture Review. But the President made clear that he believed that these reductions are in the national security interest of the country. and that these investments are in the national security interest of the country. So, they are related, but they are not a quid pro quo. One is not about the other. And I think my colleagues have tried to make that as clear as possible. The reductions that we went about in the New START Treaty were based on analysis conducted under the Nuclear Posture Review. And during that same review, it was very clear that we needed to make investments in the modernization of the complex, in the human capital, building facilities, and making it a much more capabilities-based environment than just dealing with this number, that number. So I think it's a complicated situation, but General Kaler's responsibilities, Dr. Miller's, Administrator D'Agostino's are different than mine. We all have specific responsibilities, but they're all related. But it's really up to General Kaler on the annual basis to make decisions about the safety, reliability, and the effectiveness of the stockpile for the military requirements.
Very good.
And if I could just pile on with one more comment. There are two questions here. One question is, do we need to modernize? Do we need to invest? And the answer from my perspective is unequivocally yes. Yes, we do. The other question is, what happens if we don't? And at that point in time, that's a different set of considerations that we have to work our way through. And from my perspective, that's when we get into the military judgment about our ability to do the job.
Good. Well, I share many of your concerns, and I do have deep concern about Section 255 and what it would do in terms of preventing the Pentagon from implementing New START. So as you think about it, if there are other things that you would like to add, and you can forward to me and to the committee in writing, that would be helpful so that we have full transparency into the implications of that section. With that, my questions have ended, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. This has been a very long hearing, and I have two more questions, but my two questions are for Dr. Miller and for General Kaler. So I'm going to offer to Mr. D'Agostino and to Undersecretary Tauscher, if they would like to be excused. You are excused, and if you want to stay as to watch and observe, you certainly can, but I want to let you know that the questions for you are done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and please, if you're keeping them behind in class, let me tell you how hard they work.
Very good. Well, I wanted to say that the reason why this hearing has been so long is because you all are working so hard. The amount of work that you have, the policy that you're undertaking, everything that you're doing is really the subject matter of this. I have only two more questions, and there really are for the record. But I do certainly appreciate Undersecretary Tauscher and Mr. D'Agostino's participation in the hearing. Turning to Dr. Miller. Nuclear force structure requirements are developed based upon high-level guidance on nuclear targeting strategy and nuclear weapons employment issued by the White House. DoD has informed this committee that a 90-day nuclear posture review implementation study is currently underway to review this guidance and consider options for changes. We understand the President has issued terms of reference for this study in PPD 11. Dr. Miller, what are the terms of reference for this study? I have a four-part question, so we're not turning to you yet, but what are the terms of reference for this study? Briefly, what targeting, employment, and force structure options have been considered as a part of this review? And how might those different options affect the size and structure of our nuclear force structure? Also, will you provide us with a copy of the PPD 11 and any other terms of reference or study charge? Also, please provide us with a list of the agencies and officials who are directly involved in the study. Please provide these to the committee within the next 7 days. Based upon statements we see in the Nuclear Posture Review and those made by senior administration officials, including the National Security Advisor Tom Donilon and White House Coordinator on Weapons of Mass Destruction Gary Samore, in this study, is the study only considering what further reductions can be made? Or are the only possible outcomes those that enable and justify further reductions? Is it possible that the study's analysis will show that the current U.S. stockpile and force structure is exactly right, or even inadequate, especially in view of the nuclear modernization programs in Russia and China? And how is a potential failure to fund the modernization plan in Section 1251 report being factored into the options considered? As part of the NPR implementation study, if Congress doesn't fully fund the modernization plan, does this limit what options are on the table or possible To give you a recap, the first one was briefly what targeting employment and force structure options are being considered as part of this review, and the documents that we requested, including the PPD 11.
Mr. Chairman, I assume by the length of that list that you've written it down, many of the questions that you ask go to the White House and not to the Department of Defense, and I would propose to pass them along. What I can say about I'm
sorry, before we go on, you are involved in this, are you not?
I am.
So you would have to be qualified to answer the questions. I mean, I didn't ask a policy question of what's the conclusion. I asked the question of what's being considered.
The question of what's being considered under presidentially directed review, in my estimation, comes under the purview of the White House to respond to, not under the purview of the Department of Defense to respond to. So what I'd be happy to do is to take that question to the White House.
But you are knowledgeable of these answers.
I am.
I mean, you would be capable of answering them. Okay. I
would be capable of answering them to the best of my ability. What I would suggest is that you've asked for a copy of the directive. You've asked for a number of other things. That I take that back to the national security staff.
I understand your answer. General Kaler, you have previously warned against cutting the budget or size of our nuclear forces too deeply, resulting in what you called a hollow force. Would you please explain what you mean by a hollow force? What are the risks of a hollow force to readiness, morale, safety, security, and critical skill retention in the nuclear components of the military? For the three legs of the triad, what are the break points or red lines in the size of the force that would result in a hollow force? And what analysis has been done to examine these questions, and anything you would be able to share with us? And, for example, how would cutting a whole wing of ICBMs, 150 missiles in total, affect nuclear weapons targeting? And have you seen any calls for or desire for changing the requirement of continuous at-sea deterrence, the number of ships required to keep that continuous presence in both the Atlantic and the Pacific? General?
Sir, let me start with the question about the hollow force. It's a term, as I think you know, that is being used, again, extensively across the Department of Defense from my colleagues, the other combatant commanders, from the service chiefs, all with a cautionary note from things that we've seen in our past. Very simply, what I would say is that a hollow force is one in my definition. Now, I don't know that there's a formal definition for a hollow force, but it's one that gives the appearance of being able to do the job but doesn't have the capability to do it. And I think you can have a hollow force in a lot of ways. You can have a hollow force because you're not properly organized, because you're not properly trained, because you're not properly equipped, because you're not properly sustained, because you don't have the number of qualified people that it takes in order to provide an enterprise that is a complex, experience-based enterprise like the nuclear enterprise. You can have a hollow force regardless of the size of the force. You can have a large force that's a hollow force, in my opinion, again, sir. You can have a small force that is a hollow force. And so when I've referred to the potential here for a hollow force in the nuclear force, I'm sounding the same cautionary note that my colleagues are sounding about the conventional forces. We can find ourselves in a position here, if we're not careful, where either through our sustainment efforts or lack thereof or other elements here that we can find ourselves in a place where we have a hollow nuclear force. I will tell you that my experience here is that 4 or so years ago, some parts of our nuclear force, I think we came to the brink of potentially a hollow force. I think we discovered that we had some issues in our nuclear enterprise because of lack of sustainment funding. I think we found that there were some issues in our nuclear enterprise because lack of experience. I think we found that there were some issues in our nuclear enterprise because we were so committed to the wars that we had in the Middle East and Southwest Asia that we found that perhaps at some level we had taken our eye from some of the most critical pieces of what it takes to have perfection as the standard. So in my view, those are the cautions we need to make sure that we are looking at as we go forward. Where the mixture of forces that we are looking at inside the New START limits at this point in time, no decisions have been made about what that ultimate force will look like. But we are looking at various alternatives here. Are there better ways than were described in the 1251 report to get to the balancing that's going to be required, and that still allows us to sustain properly while it allows us perhaps to be more fiscally efficient? Those are the issues that we're going to continue to look at, and I must say that I would want to make it clear from my perspective anyway, that in these budget discussions we've been having, the nuclear deterrent force has not been immune from the conversations that we have been having, nor should they have been immune. And I think what we're looking at today and what we would look at if sequestration occurs are two different things. I think the current secretary, the previous secretary both said everything's on the table. If sequestration occurs, I think everything, certainly in my world, is back on the table while we're trying to balance other things as well, space, cyber, and the other things that I'm responsible for. So, again, my caution has been that if we are looking at alternative force mixtures, that we are mindful of all of the pieces that I believe must be in place as we go forward so that we do not result in a hollow force. One of those pieces, I believe, is professional expertise and professional experience, and making sure that as we go forward to come up with balanced triads, and by the way, I believe at this point in time, certainly, a triad is still the right way to go, that we do that with the thought in mind that we would be careful that we don't have that as a hollow force as we go forward. You ask about force posture as well. And so just let me add one other thing about force posture. We both size and posture our force today based upon the job that we have to perform, recognizing that the force that we give to the President has to be able to do a number of things. One thing it has to be able to do is provide day-to-day deterrence and assurance. Another thing it has to be able to do is respond to surprise. Another thing it has to be able to do is respond in a crisis so that we provide stability in a crisis. And another thing it has to be able to do is get larger within the treaty limit so that we can grow that force up to the treaty limits or close to those limits if, in fact, the operational need dictates that in a deep crisis or perhaps if we were engaged in some kind of a world situation that required that. That means that we maintain a portion of our force in a ready-to-use posture on a day-to-day basis. I believe that's an appropriate posture today, and that's certainly an element of that is the at-sea survivable SSBNs, which I think is a critical piece of our posture. If that helps.
Thank you, General. In concluding, I wanted to say to Dr. Miller and to General Kaler, we greatly appreciate not only your time in working with this committee, and your commitment to a strong deterrent, which of course is evidenced in your questions, but also the fact that you guys are the experts. Thank you for being dedicated to this topic because we rely on your expertise so greatly. And when you come before Congress, you help us learn so that we can be a very good partner with you. So thank you again, and with that, we'll be adjourned.